I knocked twice on my own front door before I remembered I didn't need to. Then I stopped, because a deputy sheriff was standing on my porch holding a folder, and behind him, parked crooked across my flower bed, was a cherry-red Cadillac Escalade, with my daughter's husband leaning against the hood. Phone raised, grinning like he'd already won something. "Rise and shine, Pop," he shouted. "This one's finally mine." I did not shout back. I looked down at the papers in the deputy's hand, and I asked him one question. His jaw went slack, and behind me, for the first time in 4 months, I heard the sound of a very expensive plan starting to fall apart. "Before I go any further, let me ask you something. Friend, where are you tuning in from tonight? Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever had someone close to you mistake your patience for weakness, hit that like button, because you're going to want to see how this one ends. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 68 years old, and for 31 years I was a structural inspector for the state of Ohio, the man they called out when a bridge groaned in a way it shouldn't, or a parking garage started showing hairline cracks nobody else could see. I spent my career finding the exact point where something was about to fail, long before it actually did. I retired 5 years ago to a farmhouse on 11 acres outside Marietta, the same land my father worked and his father before him. My wife Doris and I raised our daughter Kimberly in that house. Doris passed 3 winters back, cancer, quick and cruel, and in her last week, holding my hand in a hospital bed that smelled like bleach and goodbye, she made me promise one thing. "Look after our girl, Walt. Don't let her go through this world alone," I promised her. I would come to learn that a promise made out of love can be turned into a weapon by someone who never loved you back. It was a Wednesday morning in March. I remember because I'd just put the coffee on and the fog hadn't burned off the back pasture yet. The knock came heavy, official, nothing like the mailman. I opened the door and there was Deputy Marcus Doyle, a kid I'd watched grow up 2 farms over, holding a stack of papers so thick it needed a rubber band to stay together. He wouldn't look me in the eye. "Mr. Higgins," he said, voice tight as a wire, "I've got a court order here. Foreclosure and eviction. Effective today." I took the papers from his hand. They were heavier than they had any right to be. Across the yard, crushing my wife's tulip bed under his tires, my son-in-law Bradley Kessler stood grinning next to his new Escalade, filming me on his phone like I was a circus act. Beside him stood my daughter Kimberly, arms folded, wearing sunglasses at 8 in the morning so nobody could see her eyes. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened next. 31 years of inspecting failing structures teaches you that panic is a luxury you cannot afford. When a beam is groaning, you do not scream. You listen to exactly where the sound is coming from. I looked at that eviction notice, and I looked at the smug satisfaction plastered across my son-in-law's face, and every ounce of fatherly patience I had left simply evaporated, like fog burning off in the morning sun. They believed they had cornered a broken old widower who'd sign anything to keep the peace. They had no idea they were about to discover exactly how a structural inspector finds the flaw that brings the whole building down. I turned back to Deputy Doyle, keeping my voice low and steady. "Marcus," I said, "before you do anything else, I need you to answer one question for me. This foreclosure, whose name filed it?" He flipped through the papers and read off the name of a company, Kessler Land Ventures. I let out a slow breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Marcus," I said, "are you aware that this entire 11 acres has been sitting inside an irrevocable trust since the spring of 2019? I have not owned this land, personally, in 6 years. Nobody can foreclose on property I don't legally hold title to, which means somebody handed a federal court a document that does not exist." The color drained out of that young man's face so fast I thought he might need to sit down on my porch steps. He looked at the papers in his hand like they'd turned into a live snake. "Sir," he said, the paperwork had a judge's signature on it. It looked completely legitimate. I nodded gently. "I believe you, son. I believe somebody worked very hard to make it look that way. But you and I both know, a judge doesn't sign off on a foreclosure without a valid deed of trust behind it. Which means somebody just handed a county clerk and a federal judge a forged document, and you were the one they sent to deliver it." Marcus stepped back from my door like it had gotten hot under his feet. "What do you want me to do, mister?" "Higgins?" I told him to stay right there, stand easy, and let Bradley and Kimberly across the street keep thinking they'd already won. Sometimes the smartest move in a collapsing structure is to let the weight keep resting exactly where it's sitting, until you've found every point of failure. To understand how I ended up on my own porch fighting for the roof over my head, you need to go back 4 months to a January night when the wind was howling sideways off the river and someone pounded on my door well past 11 o'clock. I set down the paperback I was reading in my recliner and opened the door to find Kimberly and Bradley standing there soaked to the bone, looking like they'd aged 5 years since Thanksgiving. Kimberly's makeup ran in dark rivers down her face. Bradley stood a step behind her, hollow-eyed, his hands shaking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. I brought them in, wrapped them in the good wool blankets, put the kettle on. Bradley sat at my kitchen table and told me his construction supply business was collapsing. A former partner had sued him, he said, frozen every account he had, and without emergency capital within days, the whole thing, the business, their house, everything, would be gone. Kimberly reached across the table and grabbed both my hands, hers freezing cold, and looked at me with an expression that broke something loose in my chest. "Daddy, please," she said, voice cracking exactly the way it used to when she was 7 and scared of a thunderstorm. "We have nowhere else to go. You know what Mom made you promise. Please, don't let us lose everything." Hearing her invoke her mother's memory hit me like a 2x4 to the ribs. Kimberly knew precisely which door to knock on inside me, and she knocked on it with surgical precision. I offered to liquidate some of my savings, write them a check right then and there. Bradley shook his head, running a trembling hand through his wet hair. "Cash won't fix this, Walt," he said. "The bank needs to see hard collateral behind the business, something appreciating, something real before they'll release emergency funding." I told him plainly, I could not put the farm up as collateral. It was my family's whole legacy, going back 3 generations. Bradley held both hands up like he was surrendering. No, you're misunderstanding me completely," he said, soft and reasonable. "We're not asking for ownership. We just want to form a family holding company, a totally standard move to shield the land from estate taxes when the time eventually comes. We temporarily transfer the management rights into the LLC. The bank sees it as backing, approves the loan, and it actually saves you a fortune in taxes down the line. Nothing changes day to day. You keep living here exactly like you always have." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like exactly the kind of dry, sensible advice a financial planner might give any aging landowner. Bradley had always been smooth that way, slick with the vocabulary of a man who wanted you to feel foolish for not already knowing it. Kimberly squeezed my hands and cried harder, and somewhere behind my ribs, the last of my resistance simply gave out. I agreed to sign whatever paperwork Bradley's lawyers put together the next morning, believing with my whole heart I was finally honoring the promise I made to my dying wife. I had no idea I was actually signing away everything she'd asked me to protect. The next morning, Bradley showed up with a briefcase and a notary named Pruitt, a sweaty little man in an ill-fitting suit who kept his eyes on the table the entire time. I read the first pages carefully, the LLC formation, the standard boilerplate about family trusts and tax shelters, and it all matched exactly what we'd discussed the night before. Somewhere in the middle of that thick stack of documents, my eyes grew tired, my heart still heavy from watching my daughter weep on my kitchen floor, and I stopped reading every line as carefully as a man with 31 years of finding hidden structural flaws should have. I signed where Bradley pointed. I initialed where Pruitt tapped his pen. That was the moment they executed their bait and switch, burying an actual quitclaim deed deep inside a stack of documents I trusted because I loved the woman crying across the table from me. 4 months passed in a strange, quiet peace. Bradley and Kimberly visited on Sundays, brought pie, asked about my knee, and I believed the storm had passed. Then, on a bright Tuesday afternoon in early March, I noticed a man in an orange vest standing at the far edge of my back pasture with surveying equipment, staring through a scope toward my barn. I walked out to greet him, assuming he'd wandered past the county easement by mistake. "Afternoon," he called out. "Beautiful piece of land." I asked him plainly what brought him onto private property. He checked his tablet, looking faintly embarrassed. "I'm actually not with the county, sir. I'm an independent contractor for Heartland Regional Bank. I've been sent to run a full commercial appraisal on this parcel. It's slated for a self-storage and retail development. Ground's supposed to break next month." My chest went cold in a way no Ohio winter had ever managed. "Ordered by whom?" I asked, and my voice came out flatter than I intended. He scrolled his screen and read off the name that hit me like a physical blow. Kessler Land Ventures. I walked back into my house and called Kimberly. The line connected to the unmistakable clink of wine glasses and the low murmur of a crowded restaurant. Nothing like a woman in financial crisis. When I told her about the surveyor, she sighed like I was a confused old man wasting her evening. Dad, that's just the standard tax appraisal for the holding company. I already explained this to you. You're getting confused again. In the background, someone announced a wine pairing over a speaker system. They were at a vineyard 2 counties over, sipping Cabernet on my dime while telling me my mind was slipping. That night I didn't sleep. I drove to the county recycling center at dawn, the same place I knew Bradley's office dumped its shredded paperwork every other week, because I'd once helped him haul boxes there myself. I found 2 garbage bags with the Kessler Land Ventures return label still taped to the side, hauled them into my truck bed, and drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind running through decades of muscle memory, the same patient, methodical process I'd used to reconstruct failed support beams from twisted, broken fragments. I spread a canvas tarp across my living room floor and dumped the shreds out. Bradley had bought himself a good crosscut shredder, but he had badly underestimated the patience of a man who spent 3 decades piecing together the story of why a bridge fell down from nothing but broken concrete and torn rebar. Hour after hour, I sorted fragments by ink color, by letterhead, by the weight of the paper stock. By 2 in the morning, a picture began to surface on my living room floor that made my hands go still. An internal email chain, subject line, Higgins Farm Redevelopment, a financial prospectus, budgeted at $4.1 million, listing my address, my property lines, my acreage down to the decimal. The plan called for total demolition of the farmhouse, clear-cutting the walnut trees my grandfather planted, paving the whole 11 acres into a strip of self-storage units and a discount retail outlet. This had not been born out of desperation on some rainy January night. The earliest email in that chain was dated the previous September, 4 months before Kimberly ever cried at my kitchen table. They had planned this before they ever knocked on my doors. I sat on that floor until sunrise, feeling something in my chest that wasn't grief anymore. Grief is what you feel for someone you've lost. This was colder, more useful. The frightened, grieving widower who wanted only to keep his family together, that man quietly died on my living room floor that night, buried under a pile of shredded paper. What rose up in his place was the same man who used to walk out onto a cracked overpass at 2 in the morning to find exactly where the failure began, and I intended to find every single flaw in Bradley Kessler's plan before he ever knew I was looking. I understood, sitting there, that I could not simply confront them. An engineer doesn't take a sledgehammer to a pressurized system the moment he spots a hairline fracture. You map the entire failure first, or the whole structure comes down on top of you. If I accused Bradley outright, he would burn every digital trail within the hour and lawyer up before I ever got near a courtroom. So, I decided to become exactly the fragile old fool they already believed me to be. I started calling Kimberly by her mother's name and pretending not to notice my mistake. I left my truck keys in the refrigerator for Bradley to find with an exasperated laugh. I told them my heart had started acting up, clutching my chest during Sunday dinners, watching Kimberly's eyes flash with something that looked disturbingly like relief rather than fear. Their guard came down completely. They stopped watching what I did during the week. They had no idea I was driving into Columbus twice a week on a burner phone, meeting with a litigator named Diane Marsh, a woman with a reputation for taking apart real estate fraud cases the way I used to take apart failing steel. Diane confirmed everything within 2 weeks. The quitclaim deed, buried on page 31 of that January paperwork, had been notarized illegally. Pruitt never once asked me out loud, as state law required, whether I understood I was signing away title to my land. Bradley had taken that fraudulent deed straight to Heartland Regional Bank and used it as collateral to secure a $3.2 million commercial construction loan, wired directly into an account under Kessler Land Ventures. That explained the Escalade. That explained the vineyard dinners. They weren't fighting off bankruptcy. They were living like royalty on money borrowed against a house I still legally owned, protected inside a trust they never bothered to search for. Diane looked at me across her desk and said the words that changed everything. Walter, presenting a fraudulently obtained deed to a federally chartered bank to secure financing, isn't a family dispute anymore. That's wire fraud and bank fraud, federal charges, and they carry real prison time. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle deep and cold in my chest. Civil court would take years, and Bradley had the stolen money to drag it out. Federal fraud was different. The federal government doesn't negotiate. It freezes, it indicts, it crushes. 2 weeks before that morning on my porch, I installed a small recording device inside the barn, tucked into a support beam I'd repaired myself, in the one place Bradley and Kimberly liked to talk business away from the house, thinking the noise of the old generator would cover their voices. What I recorded there stopped my heart colder than any eviction notice ever could. I heard Kimberly's voice, flat and businesslike, telling Bradley that my cardiologist had me on 3 medications, and that if she simply stopped refilling them for a month or two, given my heart history, nature would likely take its course before any lawyer ever got involved. Bradley laughed, actually laughed, and said it would look like nothing more than an old man's heart finally giving out. My own daughter, planning the timeline of my death over a rusted generator in my own barn, sounding as clinical as a woman discussing which contractor to hire. I did not cry when I heard it. I felt the last soft thing in my chest turn permanently to stone. I brought that recording straight to Diane, and together we built the final structure of the trap. The eviction filing Bradley had rushed through using the forged deed would be the very moment law enforcement arrived to arrest him, because Diane had already alerted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and Deputy Doyle's supervisor had quietly been briefed that any eviction attempt on my property that week needed backup standing by. Which brings us back to that Wednesday morning, to Marcus Doyle standing frozen on my porch, and Bradley grinning behind the wheel of his Escalade like he'd already collected the keys to my kingdom. I reached into my jacket and produced a small Bluetooth speaker, setting it on the porch railing in plain sight. "Marcus," I said, loud enough to carry across the yard, "I think you and I should let my daughter and her husband hear something." I pressed play, and Kimberly's voice flat, calm, discussing my medication schedule like a grocery list rolled out across the morning air. Bradley's hand slipped off the gear shift. Kimberly's sunglasses did nothing to hide the way her whole face collapsed. The bright, satisfied laughter from 10 minutes earlier was simply gone, replaced by the sound of 2 people realizing, in real time, that every card in their hand had just been turned face up on the table. I looked at my daughter across that dew-covered lawn, searching her face for even a flicker of the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during Sunday drives. I found nothing there but naked fear. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice level, "I believe you now have probable cause for conspiracy to commit murder. On top of the wire fraud and bank fraud they've already committed with a forged deed." Marcus didn't hesitate. He keyed his radio, and within 90 seconds 3 patrol cars came around the bend, boxing the Escalade in against my mailbox, before Bradley ever got the engine to catch. Kimberly's knees buckled as the sirens closed in, and a female deputy caught her before she hit the gravel. I walked down my porch steps slowly, the same steady pace I'd used walking out onto 1,000 cracked bridges over 3 decades, and stopped 3 feet from my daughter. "You didn't just try to take my house, Kimberly," I said. "You sat at my table, ate the food I cooked, and calculated exactly how many weeks it would take my heart to fail without my medication." She opened her mouth and nothing came out but a broken sob. I turned to Bradley, pressed face first against the hood of his own ruined Escalade, cuffs already locked around his wrists. "You always thought you were the smartest man in any room, Bradley," I said. "But you never once thought to check whether this land was actually mine to give away. I put this farm into an irrevocable trust back in 2019. Every document you forged, every deed you filed, every dollar you borrowed against it, all of it was worthless the moment you signed it, because you were never stealing from me. You were stealing from a ghost." His face went the color of old concrete. He stopped struggling entirely. The trial took the better part of a year. Federal prosecutors did not treat this as a family squabble. They treated it exactly as what it was, a calculated financial crime layered on top of an attempted murder plot, and the sentencing reflected it. Bradley received 11 years in federal prison for wire fraud and bank fraud. Kimberly, on the conspiracy charge, received 7. The jury clearly moved by the recording of her own voice, discussing my death like a household chore. Heartland Regional Bank clawed back what remained of the stolen loan through the sale of every asset Kessler Land Ventures had touched. The Escalade went to auction. Their townhouse, every piece of the life they'd built on borrowed, stolen money, was liquidated down to the studs. I stood in my empty farmhouse afterward and understood I could no longer live there. The walls held too much now, Doris's memory tangled up with the sound of my own daughter's voice. calmly discussing my death over a generator's hum. I asked Diane to help me dissolve the trust's restrictions and sell the land properly, this time to a family-run dairy cooperative that wanted to keep it as working farmland rather than another slab of concrete parking lot. I closed on the sale for $4.6 million in Diane's office, under an actual valid signature this time, and felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as relief, with the lights finally turned back on. I took a portion of that money and moved south to a quiet stretch of coastline outside Charleston, South Carolina, into a modest single-story house with a wraparound porch and a view of the marsh grass swaying gold in the evening light. I started walking 3 miles every morning along the water, something my old knees hadn't allowed in years, and found my appetite and my sleep coming back to me in a way I hadn't expected. I used the remainder of the money to establish a small foundation in Doris's name, one that pays directly for heart medication and home health aids for elderly folks in Washington County who can't otherwise afford them, because I could not shake the thought of how many people actually do run out of pills, quietly, with nobody watching, and nobody to blame. Every single grant that goes out feels like taking the exact weapon aimed at my chest and turning it into something that keeps somebody else's heart beating instead. Some evenings I sit on that porch with a glass of sweet tea and watch the marsh birds settle in for the night, and I think about how the most dangerous people in your life rarely break in through a window. They already have a key, they call you Dad, and they know exactly which memory of your late wife to invoke to get you to lower your guard. Society tells you to forgive your children no matter what, and I believe in forgiveness with my whole heart, but there's a wide, hard line between a child's mistake and a calculated crime, and nobody should ever confuse protecting the last years of your life with abandoning the people you love. You can love somebody with everything you have and still refuse to hand them the keys to your own survival. If Walter's story sent a chill down your spine tonight, go ahead and hit that like button for me. And I want to hear from you, friend. Have you ever had to protect yourself from someone who was supposed to love you? Tell me about it down in the comments. And stay close, because I've got another story coming that you are not going to want to miss.